Let's get to our big story this week. The high levels of lead in Detroit children. We've spent a lot of time concentrating on kids in Flint because of the water supply switch that impacted an entire community. But the fact is that lead levels in Detroit kids are rising after years of decline. Here are some of the numbers from Bridge Magazine this week. The percentage of kids 6 and younger with elevated lead levels went from 6.9% in 2012 to 8.7% in 2016. And while there are many reasons that can contribute to this, the Detroit Health Department did say there is a link between the rising levels and the number of housing demolitions in the city, which can spread lead dust from house paint. Now, according to the city's former health director, the demolitions may be blamed for 2.4% of kids with elevated lead levels, or about 200 kids in this 4-year time frame. Bridge Magazine Detroit editor Joel Kurth shared more data behind the report, plus what the city plans to do now. How did you initially find this link between Detroit demolitions and elevated lead levels in kids in the city?
Well, as you know, the decrease of lead poisoning in America is one of the great success stories of public health in the past 50 years. Mm-hmm. And we'd been looking at some data that showed that, it's been steadily decreasing statewide for 20 years. And we started seeing an uptick in Michigan for the first time in I think 18 years. And we started asking questions why, and we came across this study that I'd never heard about, no one really ever seemed to hear about, that showed from the city's own health department, that showed that there is an elevated risk of lead poisoning if you live, in close proximity to a housing demolition. And it seemed, very startling that there would be such a risk for something that is generally perceived as a public good, which is knocking down these attractive nuisance homes. And
at an accelerated level, as it has been over the last 4 years.
Well, right, and I think that's the other concern, is that there is a narrative that's developed between, there's a grand jury investigation into the program for the contracting. There's been some concern over asbestos removal, and it fits into a narrative that perhaps the city was so eager to have a success in tearing down tons of houses that maybe they did not do everything that they could have to mitigate the risks.
So given though the difficulty of pinpointing exactly where the lead exposure can come from, can they really say with 100% certainty, even the health department, the city's own health department, that some of the lead levels have been caused by those demolitions?
I'm not an epidemiologist. The report is pretty thorough. There's 50,000 kids, and said that there is an elevated risk. So there's definitely correlation. There's debate as to whether or not there's a causation, but it seems as though that what happens when you demolish a house is this cloud of smoke comes up and it releases these lead vapors that can get into kids' lungs. And so there's definitely enough that the city acknowledges that they should be doing more. There's 18 recommendations that came out last February. The city has done about 9 of them. And there's considerable debate about whether or not they acted quickly enough to make it safer.
In one of the sources of your article is the former health director, Dr. Abdul El Sayed, who's now actually running for governor, and he left. He did say that he thought that the city should be doing more. You referenced the fact that they are rolling out some more new things. What is the city exactly doing to try to combat this?
The city has a text messaging program where you basically put in your address and they will tell you when there's a demolition coming up. That got rolled out this week. The city has also changed a lot of protocols in terms of the demolitions. It's very technical, but essentially they're adding another layer of hosing down houses. There's some other signage. The biggest thing with lead and demolishing houses is warning people to basically stay away and not play in this area. So the city's done some of that. Some of the other issues in terms of putting up yard signs, one of the recommendations even was to relocate families. They haven't done that. So El Sayed said that there was a bigger priority in demolishing the houses than making it safe.
Do we even really have all the accurate numbers, given the fact that maybe not all the kids are being tested for elevated lead levels? So is it hard to even get a grasp on what we're looking at here?
It is hard. I mean, and keep in mind, too, the problem with the lead is, most of the problem with lead is kids living in houses that have lead themselves. So the actual number, there's been a lot of attention with the Flint water situation. So they've been trying to target the testing better. The actual number of tests in Detroit, unfortunately, has actually gone down in the past few years. But what they're saying is that they're doing it in areas where kids are supposed to have more likelihood of being lead poisoned.
So I guess maybe the bigger question is, when we talk about this, is there a disconnect between the concern of what's happening in Detroit and the concern that we have for Flint surrounding the water switch? When you're looking at it, you're dealing with an issue with kids who are affected here in the city of Detroit as well. Noel, I'm going to start with you.
Of course there is. I mean, I look at these numbers, and you've got kids in Detroit and Wayne County 2 and 3 times the recommend or the safe level of lead in their bodies. It's about the same as it was in Flint during that water crisis. I don't know if the percentage of kids is as high, but it is a big number. And you think about how we reacted there. It was the crisis of the century, and you had all these people coming in and all the attention and the activists. You've got this going on now in Detroit and other places around our state. Kids are being saturated in lead. Why today aren't we stopping every demolition until we figure out how to protect these children?
And I think that it's interesting. I think there might be 2 tracks, though, in terms of the lead exposure and where that comes from, and because it is so hard to pinpoint exactly what the lead exposures come from. And then the small part of it that may be attributable to the demolitions. Is the city responding, do you believe, Stephen, in the way that they should be?
I mean, you always want them to do more, right? I mean, this is not a thing you want to play around with or take chances with. Lead exposure, we know what it does to children. There is a big difference between what we're talking about here and what we're talking about in Flint. In Flint, the entire population of the city was exposed to lead poisoning through the water supply. That's not the same as kids living in a Detroit neighborhood where there may be a demolition that includes lead that wasn't properly abated, and so that it ends up in the air.
We're doing 1,000 demolitions a month. Who's not living in one of those neighborhoods?
But there are a lot of neighborhoods where there are no demolitions taking place, and one of them is the neighborhood where I was born, over on the west side, where there's no money for demolitions over there. And so it is different in the scope of the potential problem, but the problem itself, as Nolan points out, is the same, which is that if you're a kid and you're exposed to this stuff, particularly repeatedly, you end up with these complications that we're all really familiar with.
So what did we learn from Flint? When Flint, we lacked a crisis response, an urgent response. I don't see an urgent response here. Sending out, having a place where you can text message to find out if there's a home. I don't think that's going to work in many places. I don't think it's going to work at all in Detroit. I mean, we've got to figure this out.
There's also a question about how safe could it ever be to take down a house that has lead in it, right? There's incredibly complicated protocols that you have to go through to meet the environmental regulations to take these houses down. It's not just lead, mercury, asbestos. There's all kinds of stuff in these old houses, and you are supposed to spend the time and the money.
And the money. That's what I was going to say. And this is a resource question as well. And so when you talk about having to do those sorts of things, and when we talked about the problems of how much a lot of these demolitions have cost, that maybe that is also that's also a factor.
So what does Flint cost us? Look at the hundreds of millions of dollars.
It's going to be over $1 billion. I
mean, remediation is going to cost a lot of money if there is some sort of civil rights suit followed, class action suit filed over these demolitions. It's going to cost a lot more than the few thousand extra dollars.
Causation is still, as Joel Kurth said, a question mark. There's a correlation, and that doesn't mean that this is being caused by these demolitions. And I think we get out in front of ourselves.
What are we doing to try to figure out what is causing?
Well,
and I think that's up to the city of Detroit. And obviously, in this report that was put out, where it did kind of flag demos as a possible cause, was put out back in about February or March. And so the city has had some time to come up with these recommendations, and we'll see how many as they go forward.
And it's not 1,000 demos a month. It's I mean, it's 12,000 over a year. No, it's 12,000 over 4 years is what.
Oh no, we're going at a much faster pace than that.
No, you can't. It was 12,000 demos over the first 4 years of the Duggan homes.
It's still a lot of houses. The city boasts
about
how many they. I mean, if there's a chance that it's poisoning these children, we need to figure it out. The response. I mean, you look what happened with Flint and people holding up jugs of brown water, and everybody saying, we're not sure, we don't know. Right. And we dawdled until a lot of kids were affected.
And the city is moving forward. They're putting in some action plans in place. Let's see what more that they do. And we will have a link to Bridges coverage at MiWeek.org.